All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about Josephus and really how Josephus's history on the Roman-Jewish War gives us a glimpse as to the horrors that are to come, the horrors that are coming. It gives us a glimpse on the end times, on the apocalypse. And when you read Josephus's history on the Roman-Jewish War, it is so astounding, the horrors, the cruelty, the ruthlessness that took place in Jerusalem was really quite disturbing. And when I'm reading Josephus's history on the Roman-Jewish conflict, I find myself being disturbed. It's like I'm watching a horror movie. But what makes it so horrific is that it's real and it tells us, it describes to us, it recounts to us how utterly horrific, how utterly ruthless and cruel and vicious mankind can be. And Josephus really takes us down to the utter abysmal state that humanity can spiral down to. So right now I am in book chapter 5. They are 7 books. I've been taking my time reading Josephus's history on the Roman-Jewish conflict because I'm a slow reader, but also I like to slowly digest what I read. And so just to give you guys some context, right now I'm in the part where the Romans are they're currently besieging Jerusalem. They are orchestrating the siege of Jerusalem. They're trying to take over the city. So you have that's taking place. But then at the same time, you have what is taking place within the walls of Jerusalem. And what is occurring within the walls of Jerusalem is a civil war, and also it's vicious factionalism, and you also have famine. And pretty soon you're going to have disease. Before the Romans began the siege of Jerusalem, they stood and watched. The general Vespasian, he believed that the best way to take over the city of Jerusalem was to simply watch and wait for the right moment, because the Jews were in the middle of killing one another, because they were 3 political factions that were controlling the city. You had the faction that was controlling the temple, and then you also had the establishment. These were people mainly of the Pharisaical order. And then you had the Zealots. And the Zealots hated the Pharisaical order, they hated the establishment, and they wanted to take over. It came to the point where, because the establishment had the majority of the power, because they were the most popular faction, the Zealots had to come up with a way to weaken the establishment. So what they did was they made a pact with the Arab Jews of Idumea, an army of the Arab Jews, an army of around 25,000 horsemen with scimitars and bows and arrows, came in, they invaded the city of Jerusalem, and they slaughtered thousands of people. After this, you have a horrific situation of really what is anarchy and lawlessness. Josephus describes it as people believing that murder and rape were a sport. He describes these people as seeing how many people they can kill, how many women they can rape as a game. Oh, I killed this many people, I raped this many women, and they had their own scorecards. Not literally, but they were keeping count. I killed this many people, I raped this many women. It was like the rape of Nanking, where you had Japanese generals competing on how many Chinese people they could behead. And yes, this actually occurred. This was happening in the Jewish civil war in Jerusalem. So the Romans began to invade the city of Jerusalem, and the factions, although they hated each other, they realized that they needed to unite in order to become a substantial force against the Romans, and they were a substantial force. They defended the walls, they threw rocks, they actually stole batteries, military machines from the Romans, and at first they didn't know how to use them, but they figured out how to use these battle machines, and they would launch stones with these machines, and they tried really hard to defend the city. Eventually the Romans, being the superior force, they broke down one of the walls of Jerusalem and they breached the city. the Jews put up a very, very good fight and ended up forcing the Romans out of Jerusalem. And they, in the area where the wall once was, they made a whole wall of human defenders to defend the city. So the Jews, they went back on their ways and they started to kill each other again. But this time they were killing each other over food because there was a famine. The reason why there was a famine is several reasons that I've heard and read. One, the Jews were too reliant on their food storage. They stored up lots and lots of food, mainly wheat and barley. And the Romans knew this. The Romans had their own intelligence, and they knew that all they had to do was keep stalling the Jewish defenders, and eventually the Jews are just going to starve because they knew that they had a limited amount of food. I also have heard that the rabbis who had a huge influence over Jerusalem, obviously, said that God is not really happy with us and we need to sacrifice more animals. So they sacrificed all their animals and they had no meat to eat, which is ironic. Well, not really ironic, but it's remarkable to think about because they rejected the ultimate sacrifice. They rejected the true sacrifice. They rejected the sacrifice that all of the animal sacrifices in ancient Israel were figurative for, were symbols of. And in doing so, they kept on with the ancient animal sacrifice ritual, and they believed that God wasn't happy with them, and so they just killed all the animals, and they had no meat to eat. So they were starving. Josephus describes the city in starvation in pure torment, and it really gives us a lot of perspective as to what Jesus meant when he was carrying the cross up to Golgotha, and he saw some women weeping for him, and he said to these women, "Do not weep for me, but weep for your children." Because the little babies that were alive in the time of Christ, they would be adults during the Roman-Jewish War. And they were people who were alive during the time of Christ, who were still alive during the Roman-Jewish conflict. I mean, when the Roman-Jewish conflict first broke out, Pilate was still alive. Because Josephus talks about how the Jews began to revolt against the Roman government, and he describes Pilate as ordering Roman soldiers to put down a riot in the city of Jerusalem. So there was so much starvation that there was actually cannibalism that went on. Women would put their babies in ovens and bake them. Yeah, it was pretty horrific. Children would grab whatever bread they could find and put it in their mouths, and their own parents would pick them up from their legs and shake the bread out of their mouths so that they could take the bread from their own children and eat it. I mean, it was bad. This was really, really bad. The people were so hungry, they would hide food in their homes. Whatever food they had, they would hide it in their homes. And the rebels began to kill people. They began to kill people who they suspected would go to the Roman side. Because the Romans knew that the people were starving. And the Romans said, the Caesar, Titus, who was leading the Roman troops, I think he would eventually become Caesar, but Titus was a general, he was a commander, he was leading the Romans in battle. Titus said, "Whoever wants to come to the Roman side, come to our side. We'll feed you." So all these people in Jerusalem were leaving the city, and they were going to the Roman side. The rebels knew this, and they said, "If we ever catch you going to the Roman side, we will slit your throat. And if we ever suspect that you are planning on going to the Roman side, we will slit your throat." Those who had food in their homes were ambushed. The rebel forces would break into their homes and steal the food and beat you within an inch of your life. They would physically torture you in the most cruelest ways to see if you had food. And people would have to sell all their life savings. They would have to give all the money that they had, all the money that they possessed, just to get one loaf of bread. And I'll read to you guys what Josephus writes here. This is from Book 5, Chapter 10, Section 2 of Chapter 10. It says here, "Many there were indeed who sold what they had for one measure. It was of wheat, if they were of the richer sort, but of barley, if they were poorer." Now, when I was reading this, I immediately thought, that sounds eerily similar to what St. John wrote in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 6, verse 6. "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." That's very interesting. He says, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures for barley for a penny. And Josephus says, "Many there were indeed who sold what they had for one measure. It was of wheat if they were of the richer sort, but of barley if they were poorer." So, right there, you see Josephus talking about people selling everything they have just for a loaf of bread made of barley or wheat. And John is saying in the future, people are going to give what they have just for a loaf of bread made from barley or made from wheat. Now, I'm not saying that Josephus, what Josephus describes here is the fulfillment of what John says. But what I will say, and what I do believe, is that what Josephus describes here is a fulfillment of what John wrote, of the prophecy that John wrote. And I believe that what Josephus is writing here is a glimpse of what is to come. It's a glimpse of what is to come. And what do I mean by that? This is a subject that I find so fascinating. Because once you realize that Israel, spiritual Israel, is the church, then everything begins to make sense. Jesus goes to Judea. He's born in Judea, lives in Judea. And while he's living in Judea, he confronts and he fights against the religious order of Judea, the Pharisaical order, the scribes, etc. He fights against the religious establishment. Now, there are no more Pharisees, right? There's no more Pharisaical order. That was all wiped out. There is no more temple authority because the temple was destroyed and there is no temple. So put that aside. And once we realize, well, what is the temple? You know, what is the religious authority? Who's the Pharisaical order of today? Once you realize, well, the church is the established authority, the religious authority of our time, then you can start putting one and one together. God set up his church, just as he set up the temple apparatus. He set up the priests, the children of Aaron were the priests, the Levites. He set up the religious order, the Pharisaical order, the temple. All of this was set up by God. All of this was set up by God. They are the religious order. Okay, they don't exist anymore. But the religion of Israel still continues on. The Messiah of Israel was born, he was crucified, he resurrected. Those who accept the Messiah, they are following the true religion of Israel. They are following the religion of Moses. They are following the religion of the prophets. Hence why Jesus told the religious authorities, "You do not follow Moses, for if you did, you would follow me." And then after he resurrected, he was with the disciples, and he spent all night showing the disciples how he is foretold in the Old Testament by the prophets. So those who follow Christ are following the religion of Israel, the true religion of Israel. So, as it was in the past, so shall it be in the future. Christ is in Judea. He deals with a wicked generation. He deals with an absolutely, utterly sinister, wicked generation that murders him. He tells the religious order, "You're corrupt, you're evil, your father is the devil." And so, as it was in the past, so shall it be in the future. The world that Christ entered when he was born, it's going to be reminiscent to the world that Christ will be in when he comes in the future. So if Christ dealt with a corrupt religious institution when he was living on earth, he will be dealing with a corrupt religious institution when he returns to earth. And so God cursed Judea with a famine. The temple was destroyed. People had to give what they had for a loaf of bread. It's a glimpse of the apocalypse. It's a glimpse of the future. It's really horrific, but when you look at the fact that this happened in Judea, the land that God chose for his temple, for his religious institution, you can see what's going to happen to the future institution. You can see what's going to happen to the Israel of today, the continuation of Israel. So there's more that I want to read for you guys from Josephus. It says here, and this is really fascinating. It says here that neither did any, just look at what it says here. I'm gonna read from the beginning here. It is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity, speaking of the evils of the rebels. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly. Now look at these words. That neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness, that this was from the beginning of the world. So he says here very firmly that never in the history of man has there been a generation more wicked than the one that lived in Judea during the Roman-Jewish conflict. Remember what Jesus said. A wicked generation seeks after signs and wonders. And he was calling the generation of Judea that was alive in his time wicked, a wicked generation. And that generation would give birth to the generation that Josephus is talking about here. And people who lived in the time of Christ, they weren't all dead by the time of the Roman-Jewish conflict. Some of them were still alive. And Jesus saw what was coming. And he saw a glimpse. He saw that wickedness right there. And here Josephus is saying that there has never been a generation more wicked than the one that lived in the Roman-Jewish conflict, during the Roman-Jewish conflict. And Josephus describes how they boasted of their evil. He describes many of these rebels as cross-dressing, dressing up as women, indulging in the evils of Sodom. He describes them as parading their sin. And what does the prophet Isaiah say? In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, the expressions on their faces give them away. They parade their sin around like Sodom. And Josephus describes the rebels as being the same way. And so what do we see today? What do we see today? It's what my dad calls Generation Sodom. And if Sodom was openly paraded by God's chosen people, by the Hebrews, during the Roman-Jewish conflict, and if God allowed them to be destroyed by the Romans, allowed them to destroy themselves, what do you think is going to happen in the future? We already see a church that has accepted Sodom. We already have a pope who said, and I don't care what Catholic argues against me, we already have a pope that has said we need civil unions. The church is becoming Sodom. And priests are given free rein to prey on young men, to prey on boys. And they are, when they get caught, they are simply moved to a different diocese, moved to a different location. They are defended. Their crimes are covered up. When victims go to the church and say, "Help me," they are treated as if they're the bad guy. And yes, I know, because I've gone through this. When I reported a predator priest by the name of Robert L. Kinsel to the Monsignor that was above him, and he hung up the phone on me. And before he hung up the phone on me, he said that if I wrote anything against him or Kinsel, that he would sue me, which he never did because he knows that he can't do it. So the victim is treated as the bad guy. The predator is treated as a hero. The predator is treated as a great guy, as a holy man. I mean, perhaps the religious order of today is worse than what Josephus described. And so you see what's happening to Judea in Josephus. You see what's happening to Judea in ways that are similar to what the Bible foretold, for what the Bible prophesies. And people say, well, these prophecies are obviously fulfilled in history. No, because the church continues on. Spiritual Israel continues on. And if the punishment towards Israel is what Josephus describes here, then the punishment towards the church is going to be similar. That's why I say what Josephus writes here is a glimpse of the apocalypse. It's a glimpse of the apocalypse. Once you realize that the church is the continuation of Israel, then you can put one and one together. Then you can see what's going to happen. You can see the punishment for what the church is doing. Because Israel, ancient Israel, was still spiritual Israel. And there was a punishment on Judea. But Israel continues on. It continues on. Now, when I say it was a punishment on spiritual Israel, I'm not saying that these ancient Jewish rebels accepted the Messiah. What I am saying, though, is that they rejected their Messiah, just as the church today, to a great extent, rejects the Messiah when it accepts the Jesus of Sodom, a false Jesus. And so looking at the punishment that God had against Judea, we can see what God has in store for the fallen church. And remember what St. Paul said, the church will have a fallen away. And everyone has, people are so insane. Not just Catholics, but you see insanity everywhere. You see this insanity amongst Catholics in America, amongst evangelicals, Protestants, even Orthodox people. You see this insanity. You'll see people do things like, well, I love Milo Yiannopoulos. Oh, he was so great. Yeah, but Milo Yiannopoulos was someone who actually promoted pederasty, man-boy love, NAMBLA type stuff. That doesn't matter to them. Doesn't matter to them. Why? Because we are, not me, but the people are possessed with the spirit of Sodom. And people will look up to some conservative hero and say, oh, look, we found our guy. And one thing that I have realized in all the years of me doing YouTube videos and speaking engagements and writing articles and debates and doing interviews is that, and if there's one thing that you can learn from me, I hope it's this: nothing is what it seems. Nothing is what it seems. If you think, wow, this conservative speaker, he's our guy, he's going to help him save. No. Nothing is really what it seems. There is a song that I will listen to from time to time. It's by P.O.D. I know, right? Really cringy. P.O.D. was a Christian rock band from back in the 90s and early 2000s. They still make music, and a lot of their music was good, actually. A lot of it was really rhythmic, and lyrically, some of it was good. And they made this one song. It was called Sleeping Awake. That was the name of the song. And there are some lyrics that, when I listen to them, it reminds me of what I'm talking to you guys about right now. There's a part of the song where he says, nothing is really what it seems. Dreaming of Zion awake. I dream of Zion being awake, Zion being the spiritual Israel. I dream of the spiritual Israel awakening, but it's not. And nothing is really what it seems. Nothing. Even if you, this thought actually just came to my mind. It's like when the disciples go to Christ and they say, "Oh, look at this beautiful temple. Look at these beautiful buildings, Jesus." And Jesus says, "Oh, it's all coming down." Pretty sure that shocked them. But what was Jesus saying, essentially? Nothing is really what it seems. You see this temple, yes, it's beautiful, but it's not what it seems. Because its beauty meant nothing. Because the soul of the temple, the spirit of the temple, was gone. It was taken over by thieves. And there is actually a line where Josephus says this. He says, "Wherefore I cannot but suppose," and this is from Josephus, chapter 9, not chapter, I said chapter 10 before, chapter 9. "Wherefore I cannot but suppose that God is fled out of his sanctuary and stands on the side of those against whom you fight." He's saying here that God has left the temple and God has sided with the Romans. "Now even a man, if he be but a good man, will fly from an impure house and will hate those that are in it. And do you persuade yourselves that God will abide with you in your iniquities, who sees all secret things and hears what is kept most private?" It's like that video I did not too long ago. I said, there was a serial killer by the name of Dennis Rader. And Dennis Rader, he was a serial killer. He murdered 10 people. I mean, the guy was completely evil. But Dennis Rader was a Christian. He was a Boy Scout leader. He went to church every Sunday, was the president of his congregation, was very active in his church, and yet he was a serial killer and a cross-dresser. And what do we have in ancient Judea? Oh, the temple. The temple. The temple. Look, the temple. But the people who ran the temple were murderers. They shed the blood of an innocent man, the most innocent man to have ever lived, Jesus Christ. And God left the temple. What happened to Dennis Rader's house? Dennis Rader had the spirit of the Pharisee. He had this outward cleanliness, outward feigned piety, outward sense, outward appearance of religiosity. But he was a murderer. And what happened to Dennis Rader's house? They tore it down. Why? Because nobody wants to live in the house of a murderer unless they're sick. And God does not want to live in the house of a murderer. And he left the temple. Not only did he leave the temple, but he had it demolished by the Romans. And Dennis Rader was a murderer, and no one wants to live in his house. Nobody wanted to live in his house. And what happened? They demolished the house, and his land, where the house was, is just a vacant lot that you can still see today. Why? Because nobody wants to live in the house of a murderer. But no one expected that Dennis Rader was a murderer. Why? Because he was going to church every day. He was religious. He was holy. He was a Boy Scout leader. He was a family man. And most of the people in Judea believed that the religious authorities were on the right. They were the right guys. Why? Because they had an appearance of religiosity. They had an appearance of piety. But yet again, nothing is what it seems. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.